Hello everyone, my name is Aakanksh Gurnani, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Neuro Chat with AG. On this channel, I plan to cover topics that are closest to my heart and support the neurodiverse community. Topics related to neurodiversity, autism spectrum disorder, and more. On the channel, I will interview thought leaders, esteemed researchers, scientists, professors, doctors, and psychologists, seeking their views and updates on their latest work, research, etc. I will also chat with parents of neurodiverse kids and adults and talk about experiences of neurodiverse individuals. Ms. Sharonne Horlock is a doctoral researcher dedicated to exploring the lived experience of autistic girls. Alongside her academic pursuits, she is a passionate public speaker, educator, and writer. Her work seeks to illuminate the unique challenges and perspectives of autistic girls, advocating for greater understanding and support within educational and social systems. Sharon's commitment to her research and her dynamic engagement in public discourse makes her a leading voice in the field of autism studies. Ms. Horlock has contributed to the book Girls and Autism using her expertise in the field and has published articles to share her findings to address the needs of girls with autism. Ms. Horlock, welcome and thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you very much for such a lovely introduction.
And I'm really excited to hear your answers to my questions. So I'll start with my first question, which is, so in exploring neurodiversity paradigms with respect to autism and the language used, what does neurodiversity mean to you?
So I've been thinking about this a lot recently because I think neurodiversity paradigms are really important. However, I also really like specific language. So for me, the neurodiversity is the umbrella. And then almost on the umbrella, there's different spokes. So those spokes may be autism, ADHD, anxiety. And one of the reasons I'm really interested in the use of the word neurodiversity is because in my work, I'm increasingly coming across clinicians that describe, rather than give a diagnosis of autism, for example, a diagnosis of neurodiverse traits are being put on paperwork. And I think neurodiverse is really important because lots of people find it a more positive word than autism, for example. Some don't. But my concern is that in the UK, at least, in order to access some services almost haven't caught up. So you need the diagnosis of autism or you need the diagnosis of ADHD. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think neurodiversity is really good because it's so much more positive in lots of ways, because it also suggests that, you know, we're all neurodiverse in some ways. However, I think for me, a label is really important. And I say this all the time. When I go shopping, the first thing I do is look at the label. You know, how much is something going to cost? What are the ingredients in it? If it's clothes, will it need dry cleaning? Because a label gives you information. And I think particularly historically, the classic autism was almost, if you were diagnosed with classic autism, it was almost like your life was over. You know, that person was never going to be able to fully participate in society. And I think, unfortunately, there's still a little bit of hangover from those sorts of thoughts. So people see labels often as negative, whereas I think, personally, I think they're really positive and helpful.
That was a really great explanation. That umbrella example was really. And could you tell us about your journey as a researcher, public speaker, educator, and writer?
I almost fell into teaching because I finished my first degree, which was psychology and English. It was a combined studies degree. And I really didn't know what I wanted to do. And I remember sat there one afternoon and thinking, seriously, I'm just going to apply for teacher training college. My parents at the time were giving me a little push into making some life decisions. And I applied to teacher training college and I applied to Cambridge and Oxford because I thought, there's no way on earth that I'll get into Cambridge or Oxford. And as it happened, Homerton, one of the colleges at Cambridge, interviewed me and accepted me. So I went into teaching. But in those days, for me, teaching was about learning about who you are. So education was much, much broader than academic qualifications. It was about a journey to knowing yourself, working out which pathways to take. And academia obviously is important, but it's not the whole of life. Being yourself for me was almost the driver to education. So quite quickly, I left mainstream education and worked with the travelling and gypsy community for a few years. And that was a huge lesson, because what I thought when I started was that if I taught people about this different culture, they would listen and stop stigmatizing and stereotyping this other culture. That didn't happen at all. And sometimes I felt like my words were being translated in midair and being completely misunderstood. So what I learned from that whole experience is teaching is really challenging in the point of view that what you think you're imparting isn't always what's received. And the reason it's not received in the way you intend it is because people bring their own life histories, their own beliefs, their own experiences. And I think sometimes we'd forget that within teaching. So fast forward a few years, and I started to work with children who in those days were termed as described as children with behavioural difficulties. And whilst I was working there, I met a really interesting young man who was autistic, fairly non-verbal, and for some reason we managed to build up a relationship. And part of the day we would go out on activities, and this particular day we'd been to visit a local pet shop, and I was really interested in tortoises and still am. So I started to chat to the pet seller about tortoises, and this young man couldn't share my attention. So he in order to get my attention, he picked up a pot of maggots and threw them over me. I am petrified of maggots. So of course, as you can imagine, I was trying to pull them out my hair, take them out of my clothes. And this young man could sense my distress, didn't have the language to communicate how he was feeling, didn't have the language to communicate that he hadn't meant to upset me. And he became incredibly dysregulated and very, very, very upset. And what I took from that was, one, what really is autism? And two, what could I have done about my behaviour in order to have supported him better? How could I have planned the whole journey better? What should I have done beforehand in order to try and prevent what had happened firstly, and secondly, when somebody does become distressed, what's my responsibility and role in that situation? So I started to really explore about what autism was. And eventually, in a later job, I came across, sorry, this is a long answer. I came across a young lady, a young student, female student, who, when she became upset, would run round and round the school. And I kept watching her and I kept trying to communicate with her. And suddenly I realized, I thought, this young person, she's autistic. And it then took 2 years of a battle to get a diagnosis because she was a girl. And that was one of the first times I realized that girls have a much harder journey to diagnosis than boys. So that's how I became interested in, firstly, autism, and then the fact that females still even today still struggle to get that initial diagnosis. And that's something that I became more and more passionate about the older I got. So eventually I gave up my full-time job and applied to do a PhD doctorate so that I could try to better understand what was happening, but also to give people voice, because I think that's so important. I think listening is one skill. Actually hearing what people are saying is a completely different one.
So, what are some practical steps that need to be taken within educational and social systems to support neurodiverse individuals?
So this is everything that I talk about with you is come from my lived experiences, has come from lots of things that I've read, but also is my personal opinion. You will find other people out there that just think whatever I'm saying is completely wrong. But I think for me, education, since I started in education, it's become more and more results driven. And I think that actually we're human beings, and that means we're relationship based. Teaching for me is a relationship based profession. So we need to build relationships. And I think, unfortunately, in the UK, sometimes what happens is the need to jump through certain hoops to complete assessments, to make sure that the school is doing as well as it can with respect to examination results. Teachers are having less time to actually build relationships. And also, I think the other thing to remember is that when you go into teaching, if you become, for example, a history teacher, you're likely to have a passion for history, and you want to impart that passion for history. And you may never have come across a child with autism before. You may never have come across a girl with autism before. It may not even have been on your radar, even though in teacher training now we do have to cover special educational needs. I don't think it's enough. We do have to cover autism. Again, I don't think it's enough, because when you read something, and when, as you said earlier, when you meet somebody on the spectrum, it's a completely different thing. Theory does not always meet practice, and we need to be more pragmatic. So if I could change the education system, I would actually like there to be more time on the curriculum to actually get to know one another. And I think if we can get to know people, and we can listen and hear what people are saying, we can then find common ground. And if students and teachers have common ground, you become more invested in each other, and therefore you can support one another better.
Thing to do. So,
Well,
yeah,
I just think relationships are so important, and I think I'm sure it's similar in the States. I think you have to pass all of these exams, and you become independent. Whereas actually, I think we should be also teaching about interdependence, because if we teach about interdependence and people get to know one another, and yes, you may be autistic, but actually that doesn't mean that you don't want friendships, you don't want relationships, you don't want to share your opinions. And I think sort of, lacing things together better and ensuring that people work together rather than just being put on almost like a rabbit wheel, a hamster wheel of having to jump through certain, achieve academically. It's not the most important thing in the world for me, not anymore.
So, I wanted to ask, like, how do the experiences of autistic girls differ from those of autistic boys?
So, so I have a sort of twofold answer to this. I think sometimes they don't. I think a lot of boys and girls' experiences are very similar. I think what can be different is other people's interpretations of those experiences. So, for example, if a boy is playing with cars and he's constantly lining them up, for example, then people will just think, well, that's a bit unusual. He's not playing with them, he's lining them up. That's not normally how boys would play. Whereas if a girl lines up all of her cuddly toys, then often the interpretation is, oh, that's really quite nice of them, that's sweet. So I think sometimes we misinterpret people's behaviours, especially girls' behaviours. Also, in my experience of working a lot in secondary schools, when I've gone through the histories of some of the girls who are yet to be diagnosed, they have always had, they've always been, so some mums might say, oh, always been quite clingy to me. So girls seem to be more likely to have a very, very strong relationship. It's often with their mum. So some people describe it as separation anxiety. Boys can have it too, but I think in my experience, girls are more likely to express it. But also the other thing I've found is when I've gone through the histories, often the girls have been on the edge of things. So, for example, in a primary school in the UK, if a child has additional needs, they may have access to a teaching assistant. And when I've looked through the history, the girl has been included on that table, but not had any identified special educational needs. Or the girl has had experienced lots of friendship difficulties throughout their primary school. And that's because realistically, they've just not understood the social cues. When young people get to secondary school, especially girls, it's a lot harder, I think, because girls, the way, I mean, sounds very simple, but it's quite stereotypical. Girls will often communicate in relational ways, whereas boys will often make friendships through a shared interest. So conversations, especially teenage conversations, are really hard to follow and navigate. And I think what happens quite often is because girls are developing as teenagers, they start to develop their language, and sometimes autistic girls are left behind or they're confused about, not quite sure what they mean by that. And as you probably heard, lots of girls will imitate and mask their behaviours and find somebody in the class that they really admire and then try and copy their behaviours, which is exhausting and quite often goes wrong. Because the other thing, and this is my opinion again, I think being a teenager is really tough. And I think that when you're at primary school, you can be really accepting of one another. I don't think teenagers are necessarily less accepting, but I think they almost get that moment where they suddenly think, I'm not sure who I am anymore. I'm not sure I like what I see in the mirror reflecting back at me. I don't know what I want to do once I leave school. So all of their energies start to be focused more on themselves. And again, I think if you're an autistic girl, you can interpret that as rejection. Whereas, and I think it is rejection on some level, but I also think it's because navigating teenage life for anyone has challenges. And so it's almost that, sometimes people will say, oh, teenagers are so selfish. I don't think they're selfish. I think they're just trying to get through. And I think that is an additional challenge for autistic girls.
Yeah, that was a very comprehensive explanation. I think that's something I never really thought about, that teenagers kind of not really like trying to branch out, I guess, or like moving outside their friend groups could be seen as rejection.
It's normal. It's I hate the word normal, but it's a developmental trajectory, isn't it? But if you're struggling and if you're autistic girl or boy and you're questioning yourself quite often, which is what I think teenagers do, but I think autistic teenagers can become more obsessive about it because they're constantly judging themselves. Most autistic girls that I speak to say, I've always felt different. Where does this whole idea of difference come from? And obviously it's historical, it's cultural, it's what we teach in schools, really. Schools teach you, I think, to value conformity in lots of ways. Make sure you behave in a certain way, make sure that you do your homework in a certain way, make sure you get your exams in a certain way, make sure you go and get a job. Whereas I'll often say to students, why do you need a job? Why do you want a job? Do you want a job? And sometimes I get looked at as if what are you asking my child that for? But it's because for me, as it goes back to an earlier point, you need to know yourself. And if you're going out to get a job because you've been told that's what you need to do, are you actually going to be able to get a job that really means something to you? Do we have to work full time? No. Do we have to go out to work? No, we can work from home. And I think all of these different things we should be discussing in schools as a whole, but particularly with neurodivergent young people, because I think that one of the things I read about a lot is burnout. And actually, for some people, it's not appropriate to have a full-time job. It's not appropriate to study the same number of subjects as everybody else. It doesn't mean that you're any less. It just means that actually I know myself and I know what I need to do to be a happy young person that will grow into a happy adult.
And so your first publication, Meeting the Needs of Girls with ASD, was in 2015, and a contribution to the book Girls and Autism as well, Girls and Autism as well. So how do you see things have progressed since then?
I think we talk about autism more. I think it's more it's I mean, so normally now, if I mention what I do, then people will often say, oh, yeah, I know somebody who's autistic, or my cousin's autistic. So I think it's definitely talked about more. I think that is a really real positive. I also think that schools, particularly in the UK, are more autism aware. What I don't think has changed is that diagnosis is still really difficult to achieve. So some places in the UK have closed their lists for diagnosis if you're a girl. So you cannot get a diagnosis easily. We have something called right to choose, which means that you can go to your GP and ask for a specific provider, but even some of those providers have closed the list. So some would argue, I guess, that one of the changes is that more people are being diagnosed as autistic. And I think there's different reasons for that. I think obviously awareness is definitely improved. I think we now recognise that girls and women can be autistic and are autistic. However, what shocks me is that we don't have the right services still to actually meet this need for diagnosis. As I said earlier, I find a label really important because it gives information. If you can't get access to that label, then you're almost in no man's land of what do we do next? Also, I think that although lots of schools will describe themselves as inclusive, and I honestly believe that all schools, or the majority of schools, try to be as inclusive as possible, they still don't really know how to be as flexible as they need to be in order to meet some of the needs of these young people. And I think that goes back to lack of resources, lack of funding. But I also do think there's still a lack of understanding of what it means to be autistic in today's society. And we expect autistic people to fit into society. And whereas my argument would be that goes back to that conversation of we need to listen, hear, and find some common ground. It shouldn't be about autistic people having to change their identity to fit in with neurotypical people.
And to kind of go a little bit more deeper into that, so how do you believe society can better support autistic girls and women? And because there are fewer diagnoses in female children with two having autism, so what are your views on the steps that should be taken, raise this awareness and kind of counter this? Because I think there's a big gap between the number of women who are getting diagnosed and the number of women that studies are showing actually have autism in the population?
Yeah. No, there's a massive gap, and I think so. One of the things is that so nowadays you can be diagnosed as autistic at any age. So previously it was very much focused on young children. So in fact, when I started teaching, if you didn't get a diagnosis in primary school, you did not get a diagnosis because they assumed that if you got past primary school, you would not be autistic. So when I first started teaching, especially in a secondary school, I was coming across several girls who I thought, I'm sure they're on the spectrum somewhere. I'm sure they're neurodiverse. And I couldn't find, there wasn't even a service to refer them to at the time because of this presumption that they're teenagers. So imagine, so we now need services to identify teenagers and diagnose teenagers. We also need services to diagnose adults. We also need services to support those adults and those older people with autism. So I do think there has been an explosion in understanding that it is, even though we've always understood it's a lifelong condition, we've sort of ignored it past education. So I think that's one of the things that we need to be doing is to policymakers need to be putting some money into diagnosis across the life stages. I also think that there's a mismatch between, so if a young person is masking at school and achieving all their academic milestones, and a parent goes in and says, I'm really struggling with my daughter because when she comes home, she's really upset, she's showing these certain range of behaviors. Sometimes schools, unfortunately, are saying, well, we don't see that in school, so we can't really support you to get on the referral pathway. So I think we need to listen to parents. They are their children's advocate, but they are the people who know their child best in most cases. So I think that's another thing that we need to do. I also do think we need to put in much more teacher training should involve looking at special educational needs, and I think every single school should have, I mean, in the UK we have SENCO, so special educational needs coordinators, but I almost think you need champions for different diagnoses as well. So, you know, a school could have an autism champion. I also think one of the things that I've done before, which worked really, really well, is we would work really closely with young people and we'd ask them to train the teachers and or just give lunchtime. So I used to maybe put on tea and cake. Not many people can say no to cake. And so we'd invite the teachers who are busy, really busy people, to come and then listen to the young people talk about what's helped them in school and what hasn't helped them. So I think it's a multi-dimensional approach, isn't it? It has to be intersectional. There's no one answer moving forward. And I think, unfortunately, unless you are living it, it may not be as priority for you as it should be.
So, what strategies do you recommend for educators to better support autistic girls in the classroom? And how can schools or organizations be more accessible for girls on the spectrum?
I think one of the things that we can do is we can create safe spaces for girls on the spectrum. So that might be a group for autistic girls or neurodivergent girls. I think that's really important. I think talking to the young people themselves and parents and families and saying, you know, in order to create this space on the curriculum, perhaps we need to reduce the number of subjects that are being studied. I think that's okay. Another thing that I've always talked about is, why do we have to jump through certain hoops at certain stages in school? So over in the UK, we have GCSEs. We could Some students might be better taking some in year 10, some in year 11, some in year 12. Whereas we tend to get everyone to do their GCSEs in year 11. And I think we need to be more flexible around that. I don't think that would just help autistic individuals. I think that would actually help quite a few young people. I also think that quite often when I've worked in schools, if they have, for example, a unit for autistic people, they'll often say, right, we're going to do social skills groups. And some of the interventions, and again, this is just what I've seen and what I feel, is that some of the interventions we put in place, which are meant to be supportive, actually try and encourage autistic girls to be non-autistic. And that is not going to work because it's part of who you are, it's part of your identity. So I also think we need to listen more carefully because everyone is different and say, you know, what would help you? What would help you get you through school? And we have to have those meetings regularly because what can work for a few weeks might need a changing. Whereas I think sometimes what happens is people say, oh, actually, we've put this in place and that's it for the year. So you need to have that constant review with the young person at the center of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does
And
make sense.
you know, and also there's something, I don't know, so you know, we have reasonable adjustment is part of our legislation here, but nobody really talks about what reasonable adjustment is. And again, I think that schools, you almost need to, well, I think every school or school should group together and have parent support groups where parents can come and talk with the schools and say, this is what my daughter's finding difficult, this is what we think would help. And then you can have that genuine two-way conversation of, yes, we can change that, or no, we can't. Yes, that's a reasonable adjustment, or actually, in order to do that, we need to do this, this, and this, which unfortunately we can't do. But then you're honest and you are sharing the agenda together. And I think that's really important because sometimes people don't always know what somebody else's agenda is. So you get miscommunication.
How can we participate and contribute to your research Autistic Girl project? And if you could just explain what your research is in a little bit more detail than I did in your.
So basically it's UK based, it is UK based, but because I've spent so many years teaching, and one of this sounds very twee, but one of the reasons that I chose teaching in the end was I genuinely wasn't sure what I wanted to do with my life, but I knew I wanted to make a difference. And I know lots of us say that. And eventually I realized that how can I make a difference if I'm not really listening to what's actually happening in the classroom? So I decided that I wanted to focus on females for reasons I said earlier in the interview. But I also wanted to know if mainstream school actually helps autistic girls become the person they want to be. And so that's really what I'm trying to explore. It's whether, you know, female autistic identity is enabled or disabled through mainstream schooling in England. And what would help is if people just actually dropped me their views on that, because I am not an expert. I do have autism in the family. I have autistic boys and girls in the family. I've worked with autism for many, many years, but I'm still not sure the right way to go about things because I have been educated to teach in a certain way. I know that there's a lot of mismatch. Who can tell me about that mismatch? Who can tell me whether I've got it wrong? You know, maybe school is brilliant for helping everyone develop their own identity. And that is why I want to do this research. I want to genuinely hear the experiences of our autistic girls and their mums. And the reason I want to listen to from mums is because, again, it's stereotypical, but in my experience, mums of autistic girls need to become warriors. They need to become almost like army generals to be going in and fighting for the diagnosis, fighting for their daughters to be heard. And it's largely the mums and not dads that go in and do that. So I think that is one of the other reasons that's driven me to where I am today. I just hope also, one thing that I will say is that I want girls to be able to say to their teachers, actually, this is what I need to help me. So I'd like to think that by participating in my research may help girls get the confidence and advocate for themselves, because relying on mum is great. But actually what I want is to see people flourish and thrive, whoever they are. And you can't do that unless you really know and like yourself, in my opinion.
Yeah. What advice would you give to aspiring researchers, writers, and journalists who want to tackle complex and impactful topics like neurodiversity for autistic girls?
I think the first thing is talk, actually. Talk, listen, and hear, which is what I say all the time. I also think when you're trying to research a topic like this, it is incredibly dynamic, it is incredibly diverse, and there's a lot of intersectionality around it. So there is never going to be, in my opinion, a clear black and white answer. But I'm not looking for a black and white answer. What I'm looking for is almost like the collage of humanity within the autistic spectrum for women. And I think being part of that whole picture, and the collage, and listening to each other and trying to fit things together so that they make sense is really important. But they need to make sense to the people who you're researching, because I could have my interpretation, but if it doesn't make sense to the autistic girls that I'm working with, then I've not done my job properly. I think that's the important thing is participatory research actually is, really, really, really important and really valuable. It's a lot harder to do, I think, than people necessarily understand. But yeah.
And my last question was, is there anything else you'd like to share with our viewers?
I think what I'd like to share is, particularly if young people are watching this is, whoever you are, whether you're neurodiverse or not, is to understand how valuable and amazing you are as an individual. And I think we don't say that or recognize that enough. And that would be my message is, you need to be able, well, I would like to think that you can look in that mirror and think, I'm an okay person, I'm fine. And yesterday did go a bit pear-shaped, but that's okay, because I've got the support and the toolbox that I need in order to move forward and just carry on being amazing.
Ms. Horlock, thank you so much for the wonderful conversation and all those amazing pieces of information you've shared. Thank you.
No, thank you.